In this module, we'll address autism spectrum disorder. Specifically, we'll focus on the key features of the DSM-5. We'll look at examples of etiology and the wide range of behavioral, social, and communication characteristics typical of students on the spectrum. We'll also touch on the diagnosis and instructional strategies, as well as technological support and services across the lifespan. Let's focus on our learning objectives for this module. I want you to be able to identify the key features of the DSM-5 definition of autism spectrum disorder and provide examples of etiological possibilities of autism spectrum disorders. You should be able to outline behavioral, social, and communication characteristics typically associated with individuals with autism spectrum disorders, and you should be able to explain how autism spectrum disorders get diagnosed. I want you to be able to describe instructional strategies that we use with students on the spectrum and also summarize the services that are available to young children with autism spectrum disorder. You want to be able to characterize some of the adult services for individuals with autism and explain how low-tech and high-tech devices can be used to facilitate communication in students with autism spectrum disorders. So these are the things that you need to be able to do. So as you go through the content this week, make sure that you're quizzing yourself regularly and that you're able to do these things. When we think about how do we define autism spectrum, what you should know is that this is the fastest growing category of developmental disability, and there are cultural misperceptions and stereotypes. Autism is a spectrum of disorders with a wide range of cognitive and functional skills. Individuals on the spectrum exhibit different characteristics and to different degrees. Now, the DSM-5 has some very specific diagnostic criteria, and if you go to your text, look at table 10.1 to see that specific criteria. We've also got IDEA criteria, and this is how we get our special education services. For IDEA, autism is defined as a developmental delay significantly affecting verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction, and it's usually evident before the age of 3, and it must adversely affect a child's educational performance. There are some other characteristics that are often associated with autism, and these are repetitive activities, stereotyped movements, resistance to change, and sometimes unusual responses to sensory information. But in order to get this diagnosis with IDEA, other disabilities have to be ruled out. Now, your text talks about Asperger's syndrome, but in the new version of the DSM-4, we actually don't use that label anymore. So be sure to do a little Google search, and I'll put something in the pilot shell to address that for you. But when we're talking about this higher functioning kind of autism, it's a social disorder. We're looking at average to above average intelligence. Generally, these students have an ability to read at grade level, sometimes with comprehension and sometimes actually without comprehension. The language development for these students isn't significantly delayed, and then we use some screeners for that to determine whether or not students may have a higher functioning form of autism. There's an autism spectrum screening questionnaire, and sometimes different individuals will use the childhood Asperger's syndrome test. Now, the IEP team is who determines the eligibility for special education services based on the child's unique needs. Students with ASD may have strong visual spatial abilities, nonverbal problem solving skills, or exceptional auditory memories. Now remember that if you know one student with autism, you just know one student with autism. So these are just some of the ways that we see students with autism presenting, but if you have a student that doesn't present in this way but has other characteristics, they may still have autism, and you may still need to provide services for them based on those needs. So let's look at prevalence of autism, or how common is this really? Now, there's a range of estimates for prevalence, but what we know is that the CDC estimates that about 1 in 54 children has been identified with ASD. That's about 18.5 per 1,000 8-year-olds. The estimates come from the ADDM network, which is funded by the CDC to collect data, and they collect data based on health and special education records, and they did this with children living across 11 communities in the United States during 2016. So that's the most recent national statistics that we have. They collected information on children who were 8 years old because previous work had shown that by this age, most children with ASD have already been identified for services. schools. So I'll send you a link in Pilot about the autism prevalence estimates since the ADDM network first began reporting back in 2007. But a couple of other things that you want to remember based on this recent data: the percentage of children identified with ASD varies widely among the communities that they looked at. So in the 11 communities that they looked at, it ranged between 1.3% or 1 in 76 children out in Colorado down to 3.1% or 1 in 32 children in New Jersey. Boys were more than 4 times as likely to be identified with ASD than girls, and autism occurs among all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. For the first time, the ADDM found no overall difference in the number of Black children identified with ASD compared with white children. However, the number of Hispanic children identified with ASD is still lower compared to white or Black children. Among the children who were identified with ASD who had IQ scores available, 1/3 had an intellectual disability. So to be clear, almost 70% of children who have autism spectrum disorder do not have an intellectual disability. When we look at suspected etiologies, we know that there's no single cause for autism spectrum disorder, but the genetic link is the strongest predictor, and this is based on research of family studies and twin studies. There's also some suggestion that environmental stressors may affect this, as well as brain abnormalities in the cerebellum, the cerebral cortex, and the brain stem. Neurochemical research investigating neurotransmitters in the brain also indicates some neurochemical links, and vaccinations have not been scientifically linked to ASD. I just want to say that one more time. Vaccinations have not been scientifically linked to ASD. Vaccines do not cause autism. When we look at the characteristics of individuals who have autism, there's a couple of different areas. One, we can look at social interaction, communication symptoms, repetitive and restrictive behaviors, and then some other characteristics. So with social interaction symptoms, we look at difficulties with nonverbal language use and interpretation, difficulty developing peer relationships, a lack of social and emotional reciprocity with others, and difficulty understanding other people's perspectives and opinions. We also look at communication symptoms. Now, this means a limited or a lack of speech, speech that may not be functional or that echoes the speech of others, deficits in conversational skills and pragmatics, a lack of spontaneous language use, or the rhythm of speech may be abnormal. A third area is repetitive and restrictive behaviors, preoccupation with at least one interest area, inflexibility to changes in routines, stereotypical and repetitive behaviors, attachment to inanimate objects, any of those as well. And then there are some other characteristics, and you'll want to look at table 10.2 in our text for some of the other commonly associated characteristics. When we suspect that a student has autism, we want to look at the ways that we do assessment and diagnosis. So there's intellectual assessments and then also screenings and diagnosis. Because about 33% of those students also have a cognitive disability, an intellectual disability, then intellectual assessment is one of the things that we look at for a diagnosis. It is never the only thing, though. Second, we look at screenings. So we look at behavioral symptoms. We can have behavioral screeners. We can look at developmental screeners. There are 2 comprehensive evaluations that are commonly used. One is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, or the ADOS-2, and the other is the Autism Diagnostic Interview, revised, the ADI-R. With regard to educational placement for students with autism, teachers can use a variety of strategies to support students with autism in inclusive classrooms, and there's a variety of early intervention services for young children with ASD and their families. When it comes to curriculum, these curricula often include functional, communication, and social skills instruction. We use a lot of explicit instruction, and your text will outline some more of those things, and I'll send some video clips. As these students transition into adulthood, there's a particular focus on transitioning from high school into employment or higher education. We also have to focus on living arrangement. With students with autism, because it is such a wide range, we may have students who are independent in the rest of their lives and actually don't need any additional services outside of high school. We also have students with more significant needs who may be in supervised group and independent living situations. They may be in adult foster care situations, or they may receive residential services as adults in the community. There are some other issues that come up that you'll want to familiarize yourself with as the classroom teacher. One, there are some specific family needs and issues that come up with students with autism. There's also a great deal of diversity amongst people with autism, so we still have to focus, and we definitely want to focus on diversity as classroom teachers. And then we want to have an understanding of some technology and how we use that to facilitate communication. I'm going to send you guys some videos this week that will help with that. And then just to start becoming aware with that. It's important to note that there's not really strong research regarding effective treatments because it tends to be so individualized how autism presents and what works for students. So you have to really focus on what works for one student and be open to lots of different things. I hope that you guys have a great week this week. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Send me an email. We will set up a virtual classroom meeting, whatever it is that you guys need. And have a great week and do amazing things.